As I indicated in a previous video that I'll reference with a link in the description of this video, I have the intention to make a series of videos focusing on particular names and other terms within the Lotus Sutra. The thing that stimulated this particular intention was the fact that there are many Sanskrit names and other words in the BDK version of the Lotus Sutra, which I've been reciting unabridged chapter by chapter, that I think there's value in knowing the English translation of. So as I indicated, and again we'll put a link down below to the Leon Hurwitz translation, I want to make reference to elements of that particular translation to help perhaps enhance understanding of some of those terms. This first video will be focused on chapters 1 and 2. In chapter 1, which is the introduction to the Lotus Sutra, there's reference early on in the first paragraph to bhikshus, who are mendicant monks. Another word that is used later in the sutra is shramana. It means ascetic and is sometimes also used as the designation for a Buddhist monk. The next term is arhat or arhant, which are men enlightened but not Buddhas. And what Hurwitz says in his glossary is that this refers to a person who has intuited the truth and who consequently will not be reincarnated. The Mahayana before the Lotus Sutra denigrated the arhat, saying that while he was indeed enlightened, he was inferior to a Buddha. The Lotus Sutra says, in effect, that the arhat does not exist. He translates the word as worthy one. But this is an interesting point, because a significant message within the Lotus Sutra is that there are no Shravakas, there are no Pratyeka Buddhas, there are no arhats, that all of the disciples are bodhisattvas and should be following the bodhisattva path. And as I've indicated before, the purpose, a basic purpose of the Lotus Sutra is to serve as a guidebook for following that bodhisattva path. You'll see not only the term bodhisattva, which Hurwitz says refers to a being well on the way to Buddhahood, a being who devotes a good bit of his career to bringing others besides himself to the goal. But you'll also see the term bodhisattva mahasattva, and mahasattva means great being. These two words are frequently used together as a pair, bodhisattva mahasattva, and in my mind what we're typically referring to in that context are these, what I think of as cosmic bodhisattvas, these spiritual level beings, these supernatural beings, if you will, who pervade the universe as sources of support and comfort to us. And within the assembly in chapter 1, there are a lot of them. As I recall, perhaps as many as 80,000, and several of them are named. And again, in the BDK version, these names are given in Sanskrit and are really tough, by the way, to pronounce, as I indicated in another video. But the point here being, what are some of the meanings of those seemingly complex Sanskrit terms or names? And some of them, I would argue, are worth knowing in the Sanskrit. Now, how to pronounce them, I can't tell you definitively, but I certainly think of them in terms of their Sanskrit names. One key one, for example, being Manjushri. Manjushri is the cosmic bodhisattva, the bodhisattva mahasattva, if you will, who represents the embodiment of infinite wisdom. And wisdom, of course, is a key attribute of Buddhahood, one of the two key attributes, one being wisdom, the other being compassion. And the representation of compassion is the bodhisattva mahasattva Avalokitesvara. That translates, in one particular translation, as regarder of the cries of the world. Hurwitz translates it as he who observes the sounds of the world. And as I said, in some of these translation of these names, Hurwitz, no doubt correctly, because he apparently is very meticulous in his translations, he says, for example, he he who observes the sounds of the world. Or another one is he who does not rest. So I mentioned the gender issue there, and that sort of a modern rendition would certainly be he or she. Although, again, if these are actual named bodhisattvas in this particular context, and if the authors were intending that these particular bodhisattvas are male, well, that's fine. But clearly, the follower of the Buddha path is free to consider any of these cosmic entities, these sources of support and comfort, as being male or female. And of course, the definitive proof of that, if you will, is that Avalokiteshvara, regarder of the cries of the world, was in the Lotus Sutra portrayed as a male, but then later, as the figure evolved in China, this figure who represents infinite compassion, he evolved into the female form, and is known in China as Guanxin Yin or Kuan Yin. Kuan Yin. Now, it means the same. Kuan Yin means the same, regarder of the cries of the world. But in that context, it would be she who observes the sounds of the world. So just want to make that side point regarding gender. So another of these bodhisattvas, who I do think of his Sanskrit name, is Mahastamaprapta, the translation of which is the bodhisattva gainer of great strength. And while, he isn't one of the top half dozen or so probably that I think of as being the most common and the greatest sources of comfort for us sentient beings. But the reason, to my mind, why he is very important is typically when you see a Buddha statue or a painting, the Buddha is flanked by two primary bodhisattvas, typically one representing compassion and one representing wisdom. In terms of the iconography, according to the protocols with regard to how artistic creations of the Buddha scenes are brought into reality by various artists and by the sutras, is that you again typically see two primary bodhisattvas flanking a given Buddha. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm a Shin Buddhist. I'm a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. I revere with the utmost homage Amida Buddha, Amitabha, Amitayus. Again, he has two names: Buddha of infinite light, which is wisdom; Buddha of infinite life, which is compassion. And who flanks Amida? Well, it's Kuan Yin, the regarder of the cries of the world, which is Avalokiteshvara, and Mahastamaprapta. So I haven't read a whole lot about Mahastamaprapta, but from the standpoint that he's a primary bodhisattva who flanks Amida, I would give him place of honor in terms of recommending that as you become more focused, particularly on Buddhist art, that you recall his name in its Sanskrit form. The idea of these names is yet another meta-teaching means that the authors of the Lotus Sutra have to give a sense of what the key attributes and characteristics are of the bodhisattvas. And of course, they're encouraging the reader to pursue these fine characteristics, which, by the way, if you've seen certain of my videos, you'll realize that I tried to do that at one point in my life and basically was not able to. So, I can't, if you say, well, practice what you preach, if I'm perceived as preaching in my focus on the Lotus Sutra, well, I have to plead guilty to, not practicing what I preach insofar as that's concerned. But again, what are some of these characteristics here? The bodhisattva, he who does not rest. There again, exertion. Exertion, not resting, that's of course one of the 6 paramitas. Zeal, and the paramitas, as you probably are aware, are the actual articulated practices of the bodhisattva path, the kinds of things that the bodhisattva is looked to perfect over the course of his or her career. Speaking of career, Hurwitz in in the glossary here makes the point that, which is accurate, that in many Mahayana sutras there is reference in great detail, particularly in the Avatamsaka or Garland Flower Sutra, of the Bodhisattva stages and the different, I think they're in its primary form 10 stages of Bodhisattva path. Now the Lotus Sutra says nothing about the stages, so take that for what it's worth. But nonetheless, it does make implicit reference at certain points to the various paramitas or perfections. The practices that help get the bodhisattva and all of the sentient beings that he or she is trying to save to the other shore of perfect enlightenment or Buddhahood. Okay, other names. The Bodhisattva of the Jeweled Palm, the Bodhisattva Medicine King. What I'm most familiar with is that there is a Buddha Medicine King Buddha. And I think that in paintings and stuff, he's generally portrayed with the color blue, but most importantly, he has in his hand like a bowl, which I take to contain medicine. I'm kind of free associating here, but speaking of medicinal substances, oftentimes with Kuan Yin, and you'll notice it if you look at the video that I made regarding my grotto out in the wooded lot next to my house, is that in that particular statue, she's carrying a vase, which I take to contain healing dew. So, certainly one of the characteristics of the bodhisattvas is to provide a source of healing, and the Buddha himself is often construed to be analogous to a doctor, making the diagnosis, identifying the etiology, giving the prognosis, and then of course extending the prescription to the suffering beings, which on a skillful basis is the Theravadan path to nirvana, which according to the Lotus Sutra is a provisional teaching pending the readiness of the learner to recognize the fact that the Buddha expects ultimately that they will pursue the Bodhisattva path to save all beings and become a Buddha. Okay, other names. Brave Donor, the Bodhisattva Brave Donor. And again, one of the first of the 6 paramitas is dana, or generosity or donation. So you're seeing references there. The Bodhisattva of the Jeweled Moon, the Bodhisattva of Moon Glow. I'm not sure about these, the sun and the moon references. I'm assuming it has to do with light. And again, light being wisdom, and wisdom being the 6th of the paramitas. The Bodhisattva of Great Strength, the Bodhisattva of Immeasurable Strength. The Bodhisattva, he who transcends the 3 worlds. Now, here is another one that is not translated actually and is very important, namely the Bodhisattva Maitreya. Why important? Because Maitreya is predicted to be the next Buddha in our particular Saha world, on this earth. In other words, theoretically, I guess there's a Buddha for each Buddha world, for each world or planet, if you will. And Sakyamuni historically was our Buddha, if you will, the manifestation on this earth back in 500 BC. But the next Buddha on this earth, the next reincarnation, the next Nirmanakaya or form body will be Maitreya. And then you've got the Bodhisattva of the Heap of Jewels, and there's a lot of references in the Lotus, particularly with regard to stupas, of stupas being jeweled. Again, wanting to create imagery that draws in and represents an attraction to the reader. Gold, silver, jewels, that kind of thing. Lapis lazuli, which I think is pretty cool stuff. In a lot of the predictions that different ones of the followers will become Buddhas, the Buddha in the Lotus Sutra often refers to the fact that their earth is made of lapis lazuli. Oh, and then finally, the Bodhisattva, he who leads the multitude. And of course, bodhisattvas certainly are considered to be leaders. So those are some of the names in chapter 1 of the Lotus. And then, what about some of the Buddhas? Here are the names of some of the Buddhas that in the BDK version are in Sanskrit, but that Hurwitz translates. The Buddha named Sun and Moon Glow. And here's what I want to do here, is that when the Buddha makes these predictions, like I said, for example, where he talks about the land of the Buddha that he's saying will become a Buddha, the length of their life, the length that the Dharma will be maintained after their parinirvana, which is their extinction or their death. But then prior to all that, when the Buddha preaching in the Lotus Sutra first says, you so-and-so will become a Buddha named such and so, he then uses several synonyms for a Buddha, okay? And what I want to do is read you the list of those synonyms, which you hear repeated over and over again throughout these early chapters of the Lotus. I want to read you this string of synonyms from the BDK translation, and then read you the same list from the Columbia University Press Hurwitz translation. So, for example, in chapter 3, this is just an example, and I'm not getting away from chapter 1, by the way. I'm going to focus on chapter 1 and chapter 2 in this video, or at least that's my plan. But, I'm just pulling this out of chapter 3 because that's where I happen to find where he uses this string of synonyms. He says, this is to Sariputra, you will become a Buddha called such and so. A Tathagata, Arhat, completely enlightened, perfect in knowledge and conduct, well departed, knower of the world, unsurpassed, tamer of humans, teacher of devas and humans, Buddha, Bhagavat. Okay? Now compare that to, just to have an idea of the different translation here. Here, the Buddha is saying in chapter 1 there was a Buddha named so-and-so, Sun and Moon Glow, thus come one, worthy of offerings, of right and universal knowledge, his clarity and conduct perfect, well gone understanding the world, an unexcelled worthy, a regulator of men of stature, a teacher of gods and men, a Buddha, a world-honored one. And by the way, I like the term world-honored one, although the term Bhagavat is certainly growing on me. The other thing I want to mention is Tathagata. I really like the term Tathagata, and here it's translated as thus come one. I think it also can mean thus, one thus come or one thus gone. Here, Tathagata, he who is thus gone or thus come, i.e., the one who has trodden the very same path as all the other Buddhas to supreme enlightenment. And what I want to share, a little story, is that when I first had my religious conversion experience back in 1979, and then got really turned on to Mahayana Buddhism and ultimately the Lotus Sutra, and then finally the Pure Land School. But, during that phase when I was heavily into the Lotus Sutra, I had a mantra, and it was Nama Tathagata. That's how I pronounced it. And Nama Tathagata, Nama Tathagata, Nama Tathagata. And my mantra kind of evolved. And of course now it's just Namo Mita Boots, Namo Mita Boots. And there were 2 or 3 iterations in between here and there. And when it comes to that business of saying Nama Buddha, let me just skip for one moment to chapter 2 on skillful means, where the Buddha is talking about all the various ways that someone can attain or achieve the Buddha path. some of which involve very lofty forms of spiritual exertion, moral and ethical conduct, but some of which involve almost nothing, such as, if any, even with distracted thought, shall enter a stupa or mausoleum and recite Namo Buddhaya, which Hurwitz translates as homage to the Buddha, but once, they have all achieved the Buddha path. So to me that kind of affirms the validity, if you will, of the true Pure Land path, where saying the name of Amida Buddha once is sufficient to assure our rebirth in the Pure Land, where we will become a Buddha when we die. Okay, back to some of these. Sravaka, you hear over and over. His translation is voice hearers. These are the disciples of the historical Buddha, referencing the earlier form of Buddhism. And then you've got Pratyeka Buddhas, which are so-called self-enlightened ones. These are the three paths of the Sravaka, the Pratyeka Buddha, and then the Bodhisattva. And of course, what Buddha is preaching to all of them is to follow the Bodhisattva path toward Buddhahood. In that first chapter, the Buddha, the particular Buddha, Sun and Moonglow, he had 8 princely sons. Now, what were their names? Having a mind, good mind, jewel-like mind, superior mind, mind free of doubt, echo mind, and dharma mind. So, an emphasis on the mind of these princes in terms of, okay, now use your mind and focus on this stuff and learn it and follow this path. I think I want to focus a little bit there on the term dharma. Let's just look at how Hurwitz defines it, because this is one of the words that in virtually all translations of the Lotus Sutra, this word is left alone and just stated in its Sanskrit form, dharma, but it's a complex word in the sense it has a couple, 3 meanings. So let's see what Hurwitz says about it. Of the many possible meanings of this word in Buddhist Sanskrit, 2 seem to stand out in the Lotus Sutra. One is a constituent of existence, even a, quote, thing. Okay, so dharmas are phenomena or things. Or, number 2, a truth, a true idea, or even the Buddha's truth in its totality, or a doctrine. And that's where you think of Dharma as the Buddha's teaching. So I can't resist just giving a brief snippet from Chapter 2, which, again, chapters 2 and 16 are really the core teachings within the Lotus Sutra. And chapter 2 is on skillful means, or as Hurwitz calls it, expedient devices. And this little sentence or so, well, let me give you 2 sentences. One, this dharma, this teaching, this truth, okay, is not a thing that discursive or discriminatory reasoning can understand. So here, even though it's not emphasized in the Lotus Sutra like it is in the Prajnaparamita or Wisdom Sutras, the Lotus Sutra is very much based on the foundation of non-duality, of sunyata or emptiness, the idea that, again, words and concepts are not adequate to express the truth. And yet here you have a book, here you have words, here you have concepts. So that's why the Buddha utilizes parables. He uses skillful or expedient devices or means. Okay, so here it says, the Buddhas, by resort to incalculable and numberless devices, calculable and numberless. It's not actually just Sravaka, Pratyeka Buddha, and Bodhisattva. It's all the various religions, denominations, belief systems, whatever. By resort to incalculable and numberless devices and to various means, parables, and phrases. So you're using words to get beyond words. The Buddhas, through these, proclaim the dharmas to the beings, proclaim the truth. And then it says, a couple sentences later, these beings, hearing the dharma from the Buddhas, all attain thoroughly to knowledge of all modes. And the point I want to make there is that this word in the BDK version is translated as omniscience, whereas in the Hurwitz it's translated as knowledge of all modes. And modes is another term for skillful means or skillful devices that the Bodhisattva is encouraged to learn in order to help sentient beings transcend their various sufferings. Here again in the verse section, and you notice in the Lotus you've got always a prose section and then verse section. Sometimes you have multiple verse sections, but here it says in the verse section of the second chapter on expedient devices, quote, know that the dharmas, and here I think it means more phenomena or things, or it could mean different teachings. The dharmas are ever without a nature of their own. And this is one of the three basic truths within Buddhism of non-self. By virtue of conditions is the Buddha seed realized. So everything manifests itself as a function of causes and conditions in accordance with the early teachings within Buddhism on the 12-fold chain of causation. So what does the Buddha do? And therefore, what is the task of the person following or attaining the Buddha path? By resort to various Dharma gateways, I proclaim the Buddha path. With the power of wisdom, knowing the natures and desires of the beings, by resort to expedient devices, I preach the Dharmas, causing them all to gain joy. He goes on a little later to say, I see the beings in the 6 courses. There's a concept system within Buddhism of 6 sort of states of being, from the hells to the gods, if you will, different psychological or emotional states or circumstantial states that we can experience as human beings. I see the beings on the 6 courses reduced to poverty's extreme, having neither merit nor wisdom, entered upon the steep highway of birth and death, their woes in constant succession, knowing no interruption, profoundly attached to the 5 desires, covering themselves with lust and greed. Again, the 3 poisons: greed, hate, and ignorance. Blind and seeing nothing, profoundly entered into wrong views, which is the ignorance, not seeing the truth of impermanence, of non-self, and of suffering. For the sake of these beings, I evince thoughts of great compassion. So, again, the 2 attributes of the Buddha, the wisdom of being able to see that words and concepts are inadequate to express ultimate reality, and the compassion that comes about from the sense of interconnectedness that one can sense during the experience of the 6th paramita of prajna, or wisdom. And what does he do then? He turns the Dharma wheel, and that's the phrase that references what the Buddha does, what the historical Sakyamuni Buddha did, again what the Mahayana is saying, what the Buddha taught in terms of words as far as the 4 Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the 12 Chain of Causation. All that's great stuff. But you have to go further in terms of not just what he taught as far as the concepts and words of the path to nirvana, quote unquote, but what did he do? What did he do? He spent the rest of his life, some 45 years, teaching, basically teaching the Dharma. And so that's the role model. And that's what the spiritual Buddha, the cosmic Buddha, Amida, in my own way of thinking of it, is doing all the time, raining down the rain of the law, trying to help us figure out ways of coping with the various and sundry sufferings that we experience as sentient beings in this world. Namo Amida Butsu.